Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to be part of the Muslim Institute's winter gathering and for opening your discussions to someone who's embedded in the Jewish world and who has a strong connection with Israel, the cradle of Jewish existence, faith, culture, and identity. I feel honored and humbled and somewhat at a disadvantage in not having been able to listen to the lectures and discussions that have taken place over this weekend. Thank you as well, Hassan, for sending me some questions. And I think they have helped me to orientate my reflections and thoughts. I hope these will open up further discussion, not only here today, but in the long term. And it's an honor to be in discussion with you, Mohammed. I want to begin with some reflections on our Jewish scriptures, because yesterday the weekly reading from the Torah, from the Hebrew Bible, was from the early chapters of Genesis. We just finished reading from the 5 books of Moses, and we've just started again. And yesterday we read the story of the flood and how Noah is commanded by God to build an ark and save 2 of each species of animals, bringing them into the ark with him and his family. Reading of the flood at the end of a week, which has seen some of the most devastating flooding in Spain, was sobering and provided a terrible immediacy and realism to the story, driving home a message about the climate catastrophe and how we are failing to address the crisis of climate change, a huge issue that Jews and Muslims should be working on together with Christians and people of all faiths. I don't want to focus on that story because at the very end of the parasha, of the section that we read yesterday, there's another story known as the Tower of Babel. I'm sure you all know that a very short version of the story appears in the Quran, Surah 40, verses 36 to 37, in which in the Quran's version, Pharaoh instructs Haman to build a high tower leading up to the heavens to look for the God of Moses. In the Hebrew version, in the Torah, the story is an explanation for the diversity of language and the different nations. This myth takes us back to the origins of humankind, when, as the Torah says, the earth had the same language and the same words. As the population wandered from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them hard." So they had bricks to build with, and tar served them as mortar. And with these materials, the people stated their intention to build a city with a tower reaching to the sky to make a name for themselves and not be scattered over all the earth. It's a very interesting, modern, contemporary commentary to this story in the form of William Golding's 1964 novel, The Spire, which is built at great financial and human cost, with so many deaths taking place in this great project. And the building of the spire is supposed to be, in William Golding's novel, is supposed to be modelled on Salisbury Cathedral's spire. Anyway, that's as a tangent. But back to our biblical story, God comes down to look at the story, at the city and the tower, and dismantles the whole project, point by point, brick by brick. And as a result of their ambition, competitiveness, and their overreaching of themselves, God confuses their speech so that no one understands what the other is saying and scatters them over all the earth. The myth of the Tower of Babel is etiological. It explains the origin of the name of Babylon, in Hebrew Bavel, which is derived here somewhat ironically from the Hebrew word balal, to confuse. It struck me reading the story again this week that there is something both counterintuitive and instructive in this succinct and tightly structured tale. Language is how we reach out to each other, learn about each other's faith, culture, and teachings. Language can be creative. It allows us to dialogue with each other, to enter each other's worlds and existence with understanding, respect, tolerance, and even love. But here in this story, we learn that language can also be destructive, incontinent, full of hatred, competition, and revenge. Language and thought provide the paradigm for how we are with each other, the language of dialogue, curiosity, and peace, or a language of disdain, supremacy, and unequal power. And it just struck me in the previous session, listening to the answers to one of the questions, that actually how the language that we choose in this particular subject, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Zionism, Zionism, all of these different terms are not necessarily helpful because we come at those terms from all kinds of different angles and a different understanding. And unless we set out what we mean by those terms, it's impossible to enter into rational, sensible dialogue and be able to hear what each other is saying. Sorry, that was a little kind of didactic insight into the Torah reading that we had yesterday. And I wanted also to share it with you because our texts are very dear to the Jewish people. And it's where we get our insight. It's where we struggle. We struggle with our texts because those texts both comfort us, but they also discomfort us at times. So I'm going to turn to the questions that Hassan addressed to me. And the first one was something about myself, the work I do, what Liberal Judaism means, and its place in religious and cultural life. I'll try and keep this a bit short, so if I don't cover quite everything, might need a conference on the place of Liberal Judaism in religious and cultural life. But I grew up in a liberal Jewish home. My parents are both Jewish, and they both ensured that we had a Jewish education in the synagogue's religion school. Growing up, there were no ordained women rabbis. The first woman in the UK to be ordained was Rabbi Dr. Jackie Tabik in 1975. She followed Rabbi Sally Priesand in the United States in 1972. And you may know that, in fact, there was a woman who was ordained by the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums in Germany in 1935. She was then deported to Theresienstadt, and from there to Auschwitz, where she was murdered in 1944. But her ordination certificate and knowledge of her didn't appear until after the collapse of communism, and the archives in Eastern Germany became accessible around 1989. And her ordination certificate was brought to Leo Baeck College, where I was ordained in 1986. It was a momentous time, and it was quite shocking, really, because there were still alive people who had studied at the Hochschule and knew of her, but never spoke about her, never acknowledged her. And her name was Rabbi Regina Jonas. I was the 7th woman to be ordained here in the UK, and the first woman, as Hassan has said, to become a senior rabbi of a large community in this country. Very broadly, there are 3 areas of work that rabbis do in a synagogue. Teaching, both teaching our own members, our children, adults. We have a very broad adult education program, but also welcoming people from outside schools. We have a schools program at the synagogue where we get children from non-Jewish schools coming to learn about Judaism. We oversee the religious services for the Sabbath, for festivals, for life cycle events, baby blessings, weddings, bar bat mitzvahs, funerals, prayers, and other life cycle and special events. And we have an extensive pastoral care program, and the rabbis are key to that, together with our social worker and a huge team of volunteers caring for the spiritual and emotional well-being of all our members. Liberal Judaism grew out of the Reform movement, which started in 19th century Germany, and from there migrated to the United States of America. Equality between the sexes was important. Praying and observing ceremonies and rituals that were meaningful was vital. And like its progressive sister movements, liberal Judaism approaches the scriptures critically and scientifically. It understands the Torah to be a composite document written over many centuries by different hands. That doesn't lessen its sacredness and the centrality the texts have in Judaism, but modern methods of scholarship allow us to read the texts analytically, seeing them as influenced by the environment and time in which they were written. And that's where the struggle with some of the texts come into play. It's almost impossible to underestimate the influence that my own synagogue has on its members, and indeed the wider community, whether it's its spiritual teachings, its worship, the learning that takes place across the generations, and the networks of friendships and support that are offered. Being part of a community is an extension of the Jewish family. It shapes our identity, it shapes our thought, it shapes the choices that we make in life. The second question that Hassan asked me to look at is the following. What are the debates that we are having or are being had within the Jewish community at the moment? Does our voice count, or am I isolated in my position vis-à-vis Israel, Palestine? Of course, this is a difficult question, and I want to begin by saying that I think there's a wider question here about the impact that October the 7th and the war between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah is having on the Jewish world, in Israel and in the West. In Israel and among many Jews in the UK, today is not the 3rd of November, but day 393 of October 2023. In other words, many Jews, particularly in Israel, are still living in the moment of the pogrom, which took place in Israel over a year ago, when Hamas terrorists invaded the homes of innocent Israeli civilians, murdered, raped, and mutilated women, children, and men, looted and burned whole communities. The trauma cut deep into the collective memory of pogroms and persecution in our own Jewish history, where generations were slaughtered. We are living with the knowledge still that hostages are being held captive in Gaza, that 60,000 citizens in northern Israel remain displaced from villages and towns and have not been able to return home in over a year, that soldiers are being killed in Gaza and Lebanon, that a whole country remains traumatized and bereaved. In the year that has followed, the world has watched while Israel has bombed Gaza from the air and fought a terrible ground battle to eliminate Hamas operatives, with over 40,000 dead, many more injured and missing, and a humanitarian catastrophe that seems to be getting even worse. Now there is yet another war in Lebanon. Like Jews all over the world, my own community is fearful, shocked, angry, grief-stricken, and ashamed. We cannot set aside our feelings for those who are desperate to see family members returned to them, for children who have lost parents and parents who have lost children. At the same time, the level of suffering in Gaza and now in Lebanon, the fear of what the future will look like between Israel and Palestine is both horrifying and terrifying. The numbers dead, injured, the numbers of orphans, the destruction of schools, mosques, hospitals, infrastructure, the lack of medical, food, water, and other forms of aid to Palestinians in Gaza leave us feeling ashamed and also insecure. October the 7th has provoked a profound despair in the Jewish community, because what has been clarified, as the Israeli writer David Grossman says in a recent series of essays, is how deeply rooted the hatred of this nation is. And he adds this corollary about, I quote, these two tortured peoples. The trauma of becoming refugees is fundamental and primal for both Israelis and Palestinians, and yet neither nation is capable of viewing the other's tragedy with a shred of understanding, not to mention compassion. Does my voice count within the UK Jewish community? I don't think, in all honesty, there is unity in how we see the situation, the matzav, as Israelis call their troubles. In my own community, the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, yes, I think my voice does count, and that of my colleagues in their communities. But one has to tread a fine line in putting into words one's thoughts, because we are divided, and even in individual congregation, there will be those who are sharply critical of Israel, and others who will defend the right of Israel to secure her borders at whatever cost, and who will justify this war. And I have to add, one has to ask, what other country is there in the world where people are calling for its elimination? The third question asks, is there a meeting place for UK Jews and Muslims to come together at the moment, or are we too far apart for that to happen? If so, what divides us? On one level, there's a simple answer here. Yes, there is a meeting place, and there certainly should be a meeting place for UK Jews and Muslims to come together. And that has happened on occasion throughout the last year. I'm part of a local clergy group in the area in which I work, St John's Wood and Marylebone, called FaithWise, that's made up of Jewish, Christian, Muslim clergy. And we do have representation from the London Central Mosque in Regent's Park. I have to say it was very hard to get together during this past year. I think the hurt on both sides was too great, and the level of managing our workloads respectively and managing the feelings of our communities held us back from bringing us together. But we have come together since June and just a couple of weeks ago again. I was part of a silent walk from Trafalgar Square to Parliament Square and back again, organised by Plum Village, an international Buddhist community, and the Quaker community. And I think that says something about how other faiths and organisations have to help our two communities to get together, that sometimes we need that sort of external help to pull us together, to open up channels of communication. I think it's really important that Jews and Muslims keep open those channels of communication in respectful, listening modes, even if there are fundamental differences in the way we see the conflict. I'm not sure what divides us. There are peaceful Muslims and peaceful Jews. Again, to paraphrase David Grossman, the real battle today is not between Muslims and Jews, but between people on both sides who aspire to live in a peaceful, fair partnership, and people on both sides who feed on hatred and violence. It's far more difficult to find a pathway to reconciliation, dialogue, and peace than to continue the cycle of conflict and war, a cycle which finds its own rhythms, tensions, and hostilities here in the UK. We've seen that every time there's been a conflict between Israel and Gaza, that from a Jewish point of view, antisemitism increases, as it has done this last year. The final question you asked me, Hassan, was if there is no meeting place at the present, what might one look like and how might we get there? Does the old model of interfaith dialogue still work? What do both communities need to do to get to that place? I think we have to be realistic. What can we do to repair the decades-old conflict between Israel and Palestine? How can we bring the wars to an end? How can we end the occupation? What power do we have to dismantle Hamas or Hezbollah, two terrorist organizations, or to eject the right-wing, messianic, nationalistic, supremacist individuals in Israel's government? Our power here is limited, so we must concentrate on finding partners for dialogue and peace here. I understand why so many go on pro-Palestinian protest marches. I know individual Jewish people who have also joined them. But I come back to David Grossman's point that there is no other nation in the world whose very existence is called into question. Israel is the only country where Jews are a majority, where they have sovereignty. Those people who call out, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, often don't understand what they are crying out for. It's precisely this disregard for Israel's existence that is hurtful for Jews, not only living in Israel, but here in the diaspora. It occurred to me that the Council of Christians and Jews was founded in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War. Actually, even earlier, the leaders of my own synagogue had founded the London Society of Jews and Christians, But the history of the CCJ is more relevant because there was a recognition that Jews and Christians needed to come together precisely in the midst of a war. There was so much reparation required. Scriptural reasoning, Nisa Nashim, the Jewish Muslim Women's Network, the Wolf Institute, the Cambridge Interfaith Programme, a handful of local Muslim Jewish organisations throughout the UK are, I imagine, struggling to function in an open and effective way. Both our communities are hurting deeply in the current climate. Perhaps we can take some comfort and vision from the CCJ and its courage in beginning life during the darkest years of the Second World War, in the midst of the Nazi persecution of the Jews. I don't know whether it's possible for the Muslim Institute, together with Leo Baeck College or other Jewish organizations, Leo Baeck, the seminary that trains progressive rabbis, could create a series of seminars and conferences bringing together scholars, rabbis, imams, students, not only theologians, but a group of diverse individuals drawn from university campuses, Muslim and Jewish communities, and other organizations to listen to each other, to learn from each other, to begin with our own prejudices, fears, and biases, and so find ways of working together patiently, wisely, with humanity, and in a spirit of openness and acceptance. I leave my comments there, and thank you all for listening to me, and I look forward to extending the discussion and conversation with you.
So Hassan told me only this morning that I was going to be doing this response. And I asked him...
Is this true, Hassan?
And I asked him, why me? And he said, well, you've been doing interfaith work for donkey's years. And I said, just because I've been doing it for so long doesn't mean I'm any good at it. And then Zirbai chipped in, and he said, yeah, he's right. Zirbai is the best person to go to when you want an underhand compliment. I want to first start by thanking Rabbi Alexandra for being here. In difficult times like this, it takes a very, very brave person to cross those difficult dividing lines between these communities. So I wanted to thank you for that right at the start. And whilst there was lots that you said that I agreed with, there were lots that I also disagreed with. And I think those are the sort of important issues that we need to find ways of discussing. I liked that you started with the Tower of Babel story. I think language can be used as a good tool, and it can be used as a bad tool. But I hope that we can get away in this discussion from the politics of language, and we can also address some of the substantive issues that deeply affect us, that sometimes get lost in the politics of language. And I hope that in discussing these deeper, more substantive issues, more real issues, that we can find language that's helpful to us. We can find language that we can use intelligently and compassionately, so that we can get to deeper resolutions with regards to some of these issues. With regards to the debates in the Jewish community and your own position and your synagogue's position, so I wanted to use some of the language that you used and what would be response from the other side. And I've just picked up a few examples. So you talked about the war between Israel and Hamas. On the other side, it might not be seen as a war between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah. On the other side, it's often seen as a genocide against Palestinian civilians. You talked about the pogrom of October 2023, and I think everybody here, at least in light of the discussions we've had in the last couple of days, will agree that there were huge atrocities, monstrous atrocities committed in October against innocent Jewish people. But on the other side, this did not start in October 2023. On the other side, they see this pogroms and more as having started at least 75, 76 years ago, if not 100 years ago. And I'll come back to this. You talked about the elimination of Israel and what you hear when you hear the phrase river to the sea. On the other side, they would say that for a long time now, Muslims have recognized this idea of a two-state solution. Certainly the OIC, which is an organization of 57 Muslim countries, has for a long time now accepted the idea of a two-state solution. And there's a lot of academic work now which says, well, we know that the PLO accepted the two-state solution, and even Hamas accepted the two-state solution. So on the other side, it's not that they want to see the elimination of Israel. Even the phrase that was often used with regards to Ahmadinejad, we want to see Israel wiped off the face of the map. When this debate was raging, I tried to find the exact phrase in Farsi, and I couldn't find it. So I think on the other side, there's a different story that they have. And the whole point of this exercise is obviously to try and understand one side of the story and the other side of the story and the language that's used. And as I said at the start of this, that beyond the politics of language, we'd want to get to the substance. So in terms of the Muslim community then, in terms of the Muslim community in Britain in particular, because the topic today was British Muslims and British Jews, can we come together to combat Islamophobia and antisemitism? And I hope more than just Islamophobia and antisemitism. I hope there's other things we can do which is of benefit to society at large, and perhaps the world at large. I grew up with this idea of a two-state solution, but I also grew up with this idea, and you'll probably know people like Richard Stone and others who are very good friends, fortunately passed away. I grew up with this idea that actually whatever's happening in the Middle East, you can keep it out there, and we can develop cordial relations between the Muslim communities and the Jewish communities here. And as I've grown older, I feel that's less and less a possibility. And British Muslims and British Jews need to work together to address the issues out there as much as the issues here. And without addressing those issues out there, we'll not be able to address the issues here. It's become so big now. From within the Muslim community, the perception, British Muslim community, the perception is that there is an overdrive in the Jewish communities to defend Zionism and defend Israel. I mean, in doing this, there are three things in particular that Muslims are concerned about. The first is the dehumanizing of Palestinians, of Arabs, and Muslims more generally. To the extent that it then allows, and this is the bit that I said I'd come back to in terms of whether it started in October 2023 or before that, but to the extent that this dehumanizing of Palestinians allows and justifies the dispossession of their land, it allows an apartheid state, and it allows ethnic cleansing or genocide. This overdrive also, the second part of this concerning the Muslim community, this overdrive to defend Zionism and Israel also means the silencing of criticism of Israel through various means, but in particular through the era definition and application of antisemitism, and the silencing of the criticism of Israel in the mainstream media, the silencing of politicians and other public figures. This overdrive also in the Muslim mind, or the British Muslim mind, means that there is an attempt to silence, there's an attempt to marginalize, even an attempt to criminalize Muslims through the support in the Jewish community of things like the prevent agenda and the cancelling culture. And some in the Muslim community would even go as far as saying that sections of the Jewish community is involved in promoting, through finance and then through other means, the far right and far right discourses against the Muslim community. So that's a perception in the Muslim community. And the perception is further underlined by a perception that this overdrive is supported, if not driven by, key institutions in the Jewish community. So I mentioned earlier on that earlier this year, there was a strategy launched in the Jewish community called Forging the Future. And I've not seen the document, and I'd love to sort of be able to see it. But the perception is that this is a key plank of the support for defending Zionism and defending Israel and what it is doing that you described so eloquently in your presentation with regards to the numbers of deaths and injuries caused to Palestinians in Gaza. And this is supported by organizations like the Jewish Leadership Council, the Community Safety Trust, BICOM, the Board of Deputies, and the Office of the Chief Rabbi, and key media outlets like the Jewish Chronicle. There is a recognition in the Muslim communities, in the British Muslim communities, that there are lone voices who stand against all of this. We've heard at least two people in this room in the last 2 days. We had the founder of Namod that spoke to us earlier today, and we had Andrew Feinstein. And there's a recognition that there are organizations and individuals who stand out against this overdrive, but also a feeling that they are lone voices and under-resourced and scattered in how they do their work as compared to the overdrive that I talked about earlier. So that's just to give you sort of the use of language and the feelings on the other side so that it opens up the space for our discussion. In terms of forums, how much time do I have? Am I?
A couple of minutes.
Give
a chance for the Rabbi to respond, I think, and then we'll open it out.
Okay. In terms of forums, I think there were a lot of forums that we've lost. And I struggle at the moment, actually, to find forums where we can have these discussions. So I was involved in a lot of forums that don't exist anymore. So you mentioned Leo Baeck College, and we'll come back to this as how Leo Baeck College could be a bridge between the two communities. But I grew up with, the conferences in Bendorf, organized by the Standing Committee of Jews, Muslims, and Christians in Germany that used to happen every year. I've not heard about that for a long time. I don't think that exists anymore, that forum.
I think it does, actually.
It does? Okay. But I've not heard about it, and I don't know many people here or in my circles.
I think it still exists.
Right, okay. So maybe we need to sort of revisit that. I certainly used to have a lot of discussions with Neville Nagler at the Board of Deputies when he was there through the Interfaith Network. That doesn't exist anymore because it's been defunded by government, and they've closed shop. We used to have a policy advisors group. So this was the chief policy advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury, to the Catholic Cardinal in Westminster, the moderator of the Free Churches, the Office of the Chief Rabbi, and the Office of Zaki Badawi, the Council of Mosques and Imams. And they used to get together every couple of months. I used to represent Zaki Badawi in those discussions. And we would discuss the creases, the differences between the five principles, as we used to call them, and try and see if we can sort of ease out some of the tensions. And that worked quite effectively. I remember sort of doing a lot of work around Iraq war. I remember doing a lot of work around incitement to religious hatred through that forum, because it was quite a sort of high-level forum. I don't think that exists anymore. Certainly I've not heard about anything coming out of that forum anymore. We used to have the chief rabbi do an annual Eid gathering with the Muslim community, and that's been going on. That used to be organized through Haris Bukhari at Patchwork. And for the first time last year, I think, it did not happen. And that was sort of after sort of doing it for 5, 6, maybe even 10 years. And there are lots of local forums that I'm aware of that have just broken down because of what's gone on in Gaza and Palestine more generally, West Bank, over the last year or so. So I think in terms of forums, we are very much more impoverished now than we were about 2 years ago or 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. And I think we need to find those bridges again. So I'm really encouraged, actually, that you say and ask whether or not something can be done in light of this discussion, and so that doesn't stop here. We're able to use this as a way of launching a bigger discussion on what can be done between Muslims and Jews, starting off with the discussions that need to be had with regards to the Middle East, and then looking at what else we can do here. I like the fact that you referred to the Council of Jews and Christians and the issue of reparation and the other lessons, and I just wonder if we can extend that to the experiences of South Africans after the fall of apartheid there, with what Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela tried to do through Truth and Reconciliation. I know that was at the state level, but I can't see why something like that can't be revisited, can't be done between the two communities here. This is where the problems in the Middle East started in Britain in many, many ways. And so the two communities here coming together to talk about truth and reconciliation in a much smaller way may be a good way to start that. And it could be that it's the Muslim Institute and the Leo Baeck College that facilitates that. So I really like that idea because, as I say, we are very impoverished in terms of spaces where we can speak about these things. But this would have to be a space where we are able to speak about very, very painful things and then move forward from there. Yep. I think that's where I'll stop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was thoughtfully considered, I think. But I think if I may, I'll give you a chance to respond for 5 or so minutes to that, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you for the thoughtfulness with which you spoke. I suppose the first thing I want to say is about history, really. That, of course, we do approach history from wherever we happen to situate ourselves. And it is important to learn about the past, and clearly we don't learn from the past. But I think there has to be an acceptance of the fact that we may use different language to talk about our histories and about the past. The important thing for me is to be able to hear and listen properly, even if I'm situated in a different place. Even if I have family who may have fled from Nazi Germany to Israel and made them their homes there. Even if I have friends whose families have lived in Jerusalem for 10 generations. So the important thing for me is to hear your pain and to hear where you situate yourself. I accept that there is among parts of our Jewish community that overdrive in suppressing anything that looks, feels, walks, talks like antisemitism. And I want to be clear. I make a very clear distinction between something or someone who attacks me as a Jew, my identity as a Jew, and doesn't recognize it as being and that I would call anti-Semitic, and a fair criticism of the Israeli government. And I myself am a critic of that government, and I hope I made that clear in the words that I used about some of the repulsive conduct and language that is used by elements in the Israeli government that I would deem to be fascist. It is hateful. I'm cautious in speaking about the ways in which some Jewish organizations may be financed and pushed into positions that you describe as that overdrive. I've seen and heard for myself the American influences and the American financial resources that see our Jewish community here as being weak and unable to defend themselves. But I feel cautious about opening that up, partly because I don't know enough about these kind of workings behind the scenes. Most Jews, wherever they live, and most Jews live in metropolises of London, Manchester, Birmingham, Newcastle, Leeds, rub shoulders all the time with people of different faiths, with Muslims, with Christians, with Hindus, with people of no faith. And we need to affirm that. And I know how difficult it is. We have a large body of our membership who are students on campus. And this year has been extremely difficult for them. Painful and difficult. They've had to endure protest camps in the middle of their campuses and walk through them. And that's not easy when you're leaving home for the first time and you're 18, and maybe you've grown up in a traditional Jewish home, maybe you've been to a Jewish school, and you haven't had a lot of contact necessarily with people of other faiths. And my job is to support those people, but also to help them have a conversation with those other young people who are protesting for a cause that is deeply worthwhile and painful to them. But when you have two people in such pain, it becomes very difficult, and I think that's why dialogue has broken down. I do want to say that there are many organizations who work hard and who hold the two-state solution as the only solution and the way forward. Progressive Judaism, Liberal Judaism, Reform Judaism, Masorti Judaism, don't term themselves as progressive, but are on the non-Orthodox side of the Jewish community, subscribed to a document called Progressive Jewish Principles a year ago, which takes a very different view from something like the Campaign Against Antisemitism, which is not an organization which I support in the least. I think it is dangerous. Another organization with whom one could work is Yachad, again seeking a political diplomatic solution, two-state solution. The New Israel Fund, Na'amod, obviously. And there are interfaith, I can't remember what they call themselves, not committees, they have divisions. The Board of Deputies has an interfaith division, and we should push them to work more strongly. And in fact, they are working. I mean, I think where there is dialogue is among women, Nisa Nashim, Jewish Muslim Women's Network. And in my own synagogue, I just want to say that, and it is just one thing, even last Hanukkah, last December, just 2 months after October the 3rd, after the outbreak of this war, my own synagogue continued with an annual multi-faith Hanukkah celebration that we hold each year. And our speakers were Julie Siddiqui and Laura Marks from Nisa Nashim. In the previous years, we've had Zara Mohammed. We always have a Muslim speaking from the synagogue. And this year, once again, we will be hosting that, and you are all invited on December the 11th.